Okay, so thank you so much, Mercine, for accepting our invitation. And please, let's start by please tell us your background.
Thank you so much, Joval, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, so I can tell you a little bit of my story. Um, so originally I'm from Poland, and this is where I started studying psychology.
Mhm.
I initially I wanted to move into the clinical specialism, but decided it's not my cup of tea. But I did get some training in that area. And then I moved to occupational. And after finishing my master's, I moved to the UK, where I
Mm.
spent 3 years doing my professional doctorate. Now, how is that different from a typical PhD? With PhD, you're at the university, and then you do your research and maybe you visit companies if you're in that space. But mine was different in that I was in the company trying
Mhm.
to implement change and based on that doing my research and then thesis. And so what that allowed me to do is access to all levels of the hierarchy and access to the dynamics of the organization that are typically not available to regular
Uh-huh.
employees who just work within their position. Because my goal of this doctorate was to introduce practical change and inform science through the experience of trying to make it happen rather than being an external observer trying to measure something from the outside. So I was on the inside, and so that was a life-changing experience because I could one day I was spending time on the shop floor in
Mhm.
different departments. The other day I was with the supervision team. The other day middle management. The other day with the board, and so I could see the dynamic and influences and everything from safety to business strategy. Um, and after that, I moved to the power generation, where I
Mhm.
was in a similar role, um, also connecting academia with practical application, and similarly in a form of sort of internal consultant, where I was managing culture change program and behavioral observation program, and then
Mhm.
again based on that experience, I was bridging the world of practice with a world of science. And after a few years there, I then moved to BP, where I took a global role initially for safety culture change, then human factors investigations, and my last position there was global implementation of HOP. Um, and after 8 years with BP, I moved to Baker Hughes again to implement HOP globally. And in 2022, I
Mhm.
left corporate life and started my own company to um, help more people with um, what I had, my profile, my experience, my skills, and so um,
Wow.
that's a story in a nutshell.
Uh-huh. Fantastic. Welcome to the jungle.
That's definitely a jungle.
Yeah, yeah, I did the same. I left the corporate world to found my own company with my partners, Hugo and Paulo.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
Yes,
And
greetings to them.
uh I will. Oh, Marcin, and when did you find Hop and Safety 2?
So probably there wasn't an exact date, but I can tell you the evolution of thinking. So when I was in my doctorate and after doctorate in power generation, I already had exposure to a broad range of fields from behavioral science to system
Mm-hmm.
thinking. So I've already had that foundation and exposure. And then in BP, initially, my first role was safety culture change. And so um, this is what the focus was. And then I moved to human factors in accident investigation. So in that at that time, we put a lot of effort into developing tools for practitioners because um, human factors in investigations is a niche area with perhaps a lot of content to read, but very few practical tools that practitioners could easily use. And I emphasize easily because they are
Mm-hmm.
tools that are not easy.
Mm-hmm.
And so here, this is where at that time we've developed a number of tools, which are now some of them available through the Energy Institute. But also at the same time, we've been trying to move into more proactive space. We were seeing that other oil and gas companies start exploring HOP. We've heard from Chevron and some others, early adopters, as well as we had our own experience of again trying to develop simple and easy
Mm-hmm.
proactive tools. And so as part of that experience, and it was about 2 years overall, in as part of that experience, it became clear that what we were finding in accident investigations through the human factors analysis, we could also find proactively. So, and this is also at the time where I spend more time on Safety 2 and
Mm-hmm.
work of Eric, but also Nancy Leveson from MIT, and related practitioners. And so again, that allowed to develop practical set of tools and approaches that took these ideas that come from Eric and others and turned that into things that people in the front line could use
Mm-hmm.
with minimal support. And that was very important because I find that in that world of human factors, there is a plethora of tools,
Mm-hmm.
but very few can be easily applied by non-experts. And that was a gap that we were trying to fill. And so the then experience of working in the front line and discovering and refining, how do we discover? Because it's not actually that straightforward. Not only you need to reframe how you think about the situation and the human behavior there, but also then once you reframe it from, for example, non-compliance as a cause to adaptation to constraints, once you reframe it, then you face the challenge, okay, how do I uncover the constraints? Because they're not easily observable, they're not easily visible, and when you ask questions like what are the hazards here, you will not get them. If you ask questions about perception, what can harm you here, you will not get them. So the challenge was how to do it effectively, relatively quickly. And so that question also then allowed me to practice and refine this set of tools and approaches to enable us to access this realm of constraints, error traps, and organizational influences that typically are not part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Fantastic, Marcin. And I think that it's very important that you mentioned how to make that easier to apply in the everyday work. And that brings me one question about learning.
Hmm.
Uh, in your opinion, why has the concept of learning been so absent from the vocabulary of us safety professionals and for so long?
And perhaps I would add to it that the idea of continuous improvement and learning organization perhaps are not new. CI, Six Sigma, and those
Uh-huh.
methodologies have been here for a long time. And the one of the subcomponents of the safety culture model from James Reason is that learning culture. Um, However, having said that, despite some of those references being present, the question is what that really means in practice. What does it mean that we learn? And so what I found on my journey and in my experience, that for most companies I've seen, that meant that there is a failure, then we investigate that failure, we create some form of briefing note, like a 1-pager, 2-pager, and we send it to as many people for whom this may be possibly relevant as possible. Right? And so that is learning, that informing someone about something is a form of learning. And that was typically triggered by failure of some sort. And of course, it could be more sophisticated with levels, triggers, etc. But that was the main principle. And so here is where the learning from normal work comes into play and enhances that learning. Because first of all, if failure and success have the same underpinnings, have the same causes, then we can find them before the accident, and we do. And this is what we experience when we start asking about error traps and constraints. We find the same things that we find in accident investigations. And then the other aspect is who is learning from who, because in the context of failure, right, it was a typically investigation team that was learning about the event, which typically is construed of a unique set of circumstances and then passing that on. With regard to proactive learning and the angle of learning from normal work, now it's the people who do not do the work. So typically that in practice means HSE and operational people. Outside of oil and gas, we also have importance of quality. So it's a quality participants who learn from people doing the work. And so then that surfaces not only the things that could result in an incident, but also surfaces variability. So it surfaces and sheds light on varying set of conditions that have potential to create an event if they combined in a certain way. And so then from there, the question also becomes, now once we've learned about the constraints, what happens with that insight? And when we look for constraints, these are typically things external to the person. So the procedure is out of date, the tools is missing, or the tool is incorrect, or I don't have enough space, or the buttons are confusing, right? And so the question is, what are we going to do? And so now, once we have a process where we can prioritize, validate, and resource improvements, then that means that we can tangibly reduce the risk through action rather than awareness, broad general awareness about an event and relying on people's knowledge or understanding and therefore behavioral measures to prevent. And so now, why this angle, coming back to your question, why was this angle missing? So my take on that is that it comes with the understanding of accident causation. So we deal with complex reality, and we're trying to make sense of the complex reality. And so we use research and experience and different scientific frameworks and models to inform us and help us to make sense of that. And so one very influential model was the domino effect, right? It told us a model, a proposition of how accidents happen, and you've got the domino effect. Another model was the Swiss cheese. Another model was, for example, a behavioral model, right? Which in its oversimplified version claims that it's the behavior that is the problem. And now, depending on that model, on that framework, we focus on different things. So if our mental model is that it's the behavior that is the cause of accidents, it's unsafe acts, right, then we are going to focus on that. And that focus means our attention, means our language, means our wording, means our questions, and means also, therefore, the answers that we get. And so What I would say is that operational learning then comes from an emergence of a new model, call it a philosophy. The emergence of HOP did not happen through a scientific research like some other approaches, right? But it emerged from the need of practitioners to find a practical, hands-on tools and solutions that would be easy to use. But with that, it drew from those other fields, but it offered a new perspective, a new model, a new angle. And that combined with Safety 2 from Eric, the research on variability, the influence of systems thinking, right? And through its simplicity in communication, through principles, etc., allowed to now to reshape that model and allow us, therefore, to look at different things and ask different questions, therefore creating a new opportunity to find things that previously were there, but were hidden from us because we were not able to see them, to notice them because of our mental
Yeah,
mental model.
yeah. And so interesting because the traditional mental model is that learning is telling. Learning is like a one-way street. And
Right.
I like the metaphor of that the new role of safety professional is to understand learning as a two-way street.
Hmm.
Because when you talk and you ask open questions with a different mental model, and then you have a real conversation about risk, and then safety emerges from that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so hard for us safety practitioners to change this mental model, isn't it?
It is. It's genuinely hard. It's genuinely hard. Um, and it's two things. It's the mental model or mindset to simply, and then there
Uh-huh.
is skills. So
Yeah.
I see in my experience is that people can recite the principles, very easily and when walking in the middle of the night, and yet, despite that, they are not able to ask effective questions. For example, they're not able to find constraints and challenges. And so I see mindset and skill set as intertwined,
Mhm.
nevertheless, two things that require separate approach. We need to help with the mindset and we need to practice the development of the skill.
Skills. Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Uh, yeah. So, where should we start to do this operational learning? In practice, how can supervisors and managers start to do it?
Um, so assuming that they've got a good handle on the mindset and the skill set. There are a couple different starting points. There is no silver bullet on
Mhm.
or one golden path that applies equally to everyone. But those starting points may also depend on the context. So, for example, if a company has a trend of injuries and they would like to get ahead of those, then you can look into the activities that resulted in injury. But there is a key difference. So, um, not on injury. So when we try to learn proactively and we use existing trend, and let's say you've had hand injuries as a trend. So we don't ask why the hand injuries occurred, but we try to identify the activities and tasks that were performed when injury occurred. And then we focus on those tasks. So whether that is welding, assembling, hammering, or whatever it
Mhm.
may be, we then ask what makes this task difficult and take it from there. So that's one starting point. The second starting point that tends to be very effective is um, asking people. I remember with one customer, we tried to analyze methodically the critical tasks and high-risk activities and have some sort of matrix that would allow us to prioritize our focus. And then the team went to the field and asked the people doing the work, look, what are you most concerned about? And immediately they said, look, on 2 times a month, there is this, we work under the suspended load. The maintenance of this big piece of equipment requires to, this is suspended because there's no other way to lay it, and we need to get from beneath into it. And so this is concerning, right? Because if the crane fails or something about the crane fails, then it's immediate death. And so it would be very difficult to get to that through that systematic analysis taking place in the office based on the job descriptions and overview of activities overall. And asking people would immediately allow to point. So it was very, very efficient. And so the ability to ask questions and ask what the people doing the work, what they would prioritize to focus and what they're concerned about is probably for me the most effective way of going about it, because it just puts you straight to the hotspot of the problem.
Yeah, but considering your consulting experience, how hard do you find for managers to change their mindset and start to make different questions?
This is a real effort. It's, in my experience, mindset transformation is not easy to achieve, and it's not easy to achieve through, for example, awareness type of efforts. So because telling people, so giving people information about something is not sufficient to reconstruct the mental model, especially if, as part of the mental model, we deal with values and emotions and established practices. And so, in my experience, I developed this 1 day long experience for leaders. I call it Mindset Shifter, where we take leaders on a journey to put themselves in shoes of different people and experience the challenges of work. And through that experience, they start getting aha moments, because it's not like, if I try to just simply explain with words, oh, look, this person is now doing something unsafe and you shouldn't be seeing this as unsafe, but rather something else. Even if they intellectually accept, that will not lead to the refrain. But if I say, okay, imagine you are them, and this is your situation, this is your context. Now you have to complete the job. Now, what do you do given the circumstances and challenges? If you have not enough time and the tools are not available, and your training was not helpful, what do you do? And this is an example of an exercise where that we practice, and then leaders start getting, okay, so I would then, for example, open the remote and play with electronics to make it move. Is it unsafe? Of course, but this is what I would do given the circumstances. And so situations like that, experience like that, leads to this aha moment saying, okay, if I would do it, then, and I now understand why I would do it, then maybe the same applies to other people, and maybe they do it because it makes sense. And it's just not easy to see why it makes sense, because some of those resource constraints and the history is not observable. You could stand there, and if you just observed, you would not see those things. And so that's the experience. And so it's and practicing questions also needs feedback and needs effort and a realization that, oh, if I ask the question, if I frame the question that way, I have best intention, and yet I just made the other person feel defensive.
Yeah.
Now what?
Yeah.
Okay, so no conversations happening. So how do I need to reframe my question? And so these are the skills that need to be practiced, because the leadership support, understanding and support is the enabler of success. Without it, it's just very difficult to achieve tangible, meaningful transformation.
Okay. And once they have reframed and developed better skills of questioning, they still have targets and goals of behavioral observations, like twice a week, and they have to change like their documentations and procedures. And what advice can you offer to those trying to improve and change their documentation to transform their safety practice, for example?
Sure. So then we have a number of processes that now can be enriched with this angle, right? Because if we take, for example, safety observations, and so far the observation was I've got my checklist with behaviors. I go to the field, I observe for 5 minutes, and I have 5 minutes conversation, thanking them, okay, you behaved safely, and that's it, and I put it in the system, right? If that exists, then we can enrich it. So we can, for example, start with the conversation, rapidly build rapport, and focus and ask
Mm-hmm.
questions about the error traps and constraints, and use the same flow, the
Mm-hmm.
same stages in the process, just with different focus. And then this process will have an ecosystem, right? Because typically there would be a training, there would be a procedure of sort or a policy, there will be templates for it, there will be database of sort, there will be some reporting mechanism. So those are different pieces, right? And they can be enriched, they can be enhanced with shift in the focus. So, for example, the checklist, I think that is still fine to look into, to still be mindful of unsafe behaviors. That's fine. But we could shift the focus to constraints, and so put less emphasis on behaviors and put more emphasis on a conversation about errors. We can tweak the data collection or the database so that we not only collect the list behaviors, but we also start collecting information about error traps and constraints, and we can enhance training. And so we can look at that process as an ecosystem, and it is a matter of conversation and a few hours of going through it and agreeing what type of tweaks we would like to make to this. And this idea of tweaking, enriching the ecosystem of different elements then can be applied to other processes, whether that's risk assessment, whether that's investigation, whether that's um, leadership visits, right, or audits. Those can be tweaked and enriched to offer a new insight without a major overhaul or without, throwing something away to introduce something completely new.
Yeah, even in quality audits, you can change that approach, don't you think?
Oh, definitely. We see big benefits in quality, and I've worked with many black belts, so very
Mm-hmm.
experienced CI and Six Sigma people who said when we changed the angle, when we changed the lens, we then start seeing new things that were not visible to us before,
Mm-hmm.
despite this huge library of CI tools that exist in the world of Lean and Six Sigma. So definitely the quality teams see the value and can benefit from it to reduce the defects and associated costs.
Mm-hmm. I always tell managers to leave the checklist, the behavioral checklist at the office and then go. Okay, reach your goals. If you have to do it twice a week, go, but just forget the checklist. Just
Mhm.
ask open questions. You are achieving your goal, but in a different way.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. So, and there can be the light touch, or it can be more in depth um, um, redesign. But overall, the focus is on enriching, and you can use what's the existing flow
Mm-hmm.
to get a new quality of insight.
Yeah, yeah. And Marcin, how can we learn more from you? Tell us about your courses.
Thank you so much. So there are a number of resources that are available on my website. There is an email course with fundamental introduction. Then there is the e-learning course. So please see
Mm-hmm.
the a description under that video for a link. And then we've got also we help leaders. So there is 1 day mindset shifter that takes leaders on that journey to reframe how they interpret behavior and safety. We have investigation courses that build on the ideas of safety to system thinking, and there is 2 day and a 5 day deep dive, risk assessment integration, and also the 6 month long competency pathway
Wow.
for those who want to deep dive into a range of topics and take a practical action. It's a very practical developmental journey where you learn tools and then apply it and then get feedback on the practical application in the range of areas from design to error prediction to psychology of non-compliance to resilient leadership and how to integrate with existing processes. So that's the deepest dive for those who want to
Mm-hmm.
develop in this area.
So, Marcin, you're talking about e-courses, e-learning, and what about in-company and live courses? Are you traveling a lot? Have you ever been to Brazil?
I have not,
Oh,
but I very much look forward to it. And my first opportunity may be in October. Um, Hopefully this will work out. So I'll be in the area of San Jose. Um, and yeah, so I do live, I do face to face, I do online and facilitated um, workshops for leaders because it's all about the transformation journey.
mm-hmm.
Um, and I enjoy taking people on that journey with me.
Uh-huh. And how much are you traveling around the world?
So it will vary depending on month, but typically at least once a month. Um, but depending on number of projects
Mm-hmm.
that are taking place.
Yeah, and how do you see this movement of changing in safety all over the world? Because here in Brazil, I see it starting, but it's how can I say it's getting strong, it's getting track. And what about the rest of the world? What do you see?
I see that movement globally. Both Americas, I see Europe, Middle East, Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Great to see some very influential, very senior and executive leaders supporting that. Nevertheless, one of the most common questions that people come to me with is, okay, so we did the introduction to HOP and the principles, and now what?
Mm-hmm.
Um, or we've done, we are doing learning teams. Okay, is that
Mm-hmm.
it? Is there more to it? And there is lots of content to read and lots of ideas to explore, but there is very little hands-on guidance on how to actually implement it and integrate it in a way that makes sense, works, and adds tangible value and reduces the risk in a meaningful way. And I think this is the struggle that comes after the initial excitement driven by the awareness to the philosophy. And then HOP tends to be led through the principles. So typically the awareness tends to start with the principles, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then there are other fields that perhaps were not as effective with popularizing the tools, but do bring valuable tools, whether that's human factors discipline, right? Whether that's system thinking, whether that's resilience engineering, those tools that emerge in academia then can also bring valuable perspective and tools, although those tools often need to be adjusted and adapted for the frontline implementation where there are no human factors experts available.
Yeah, nice. And very nice that you mentioned learning teams. Here in Brazil, I think the most difficult path is I did a learning team. I have a huge map with ideas and risks. And then what? How can I get all those learning and spread along the company? Because here in Brazil, we have very large companies, multinational companies. But see, I did a learning team here. In my city, I live northeastern Brazil, Fortaleza. And then someone in Middle East working for the same company has a similar problem. How can he learn from my experience? This is the challenge, to put this in a system that all the world, all the branches can learn. Does it make sense for you?
Yeah, and I've experienced exactly the same thing. So when I was in corporate world, learning team is a great tool, but in my experience, it never was the full solution. It was a starting point to get insights, right? And then you got that wall of insight. Okay, and now what? So some things are impossible to apply. Some of those things are, can be repeated. Some of the things that came out were already resolved on other sites, using different process or based on different experience. And so we needed a mechanism to, first of all, prioritize not only preference from the participants on what they would like, but then prioritize with the leadership team based on the available resources, right? Because if the preference is to put a new floor on the entire factory, right, and it will cost you 10 million, and there is nowhere close in the capex that we can get that funding, then this is not happening. So what can we afford? What can we practically do? So there is the prioritization and validation as well with the management team, and then there is meaningful sharing. So how do other sites know what you've discovered? How do you know what they've discovered? And how relevant particular findings are to different sites. So let's say that I had 100 workshops spread across the US, and I did learning teams in 2 of them, right? And so now I've discovered a range of different issues. And so which issues are relevant to which site? Because not everything is relevant to everyone. So which sites use the same, for example, models of equipment? Which sites have the same processes, right? These are the very practical questions that needed to be answered. And so what I started implementing is that process of review and validation, where the management team would go through the findings and then say, okay, on the other side, we didn't do the learning teams, but we already working with a local supplier who has that risk reduction tool there, so it can be used here easily in a different way compared to suggested in the learning team, nevertheless achieving the same objective. And then you can grow in scale, right? So that was, I mentioned US, but then what about Americas? What about globally? And so we had that process of review and escalation to decide, okay, which of the problems and solutions are applicable at the site level, at the country level, at the region level, and globally. And then depending on those decisions, the resourcing would have to be negotiated, right? Because now if you want to implement a new tool, for example, or a new process or a new solution, let's say on a regional level or a global level, then that will affect CapEx planning, budgets, lots of stakeholders, right? Especially if you from engineering to facilities, etc. So the process required to account for that in practice and make it useful, helpful,
Mhm.
real, and practical um, to deal with that.
Yeah, yeah. But these learning exchanges must be held on some platform. Uh,
Mm.
are we talking about a new software, an existing software, or monthly meetings, global meetings? Because I'm this is my doubt. How can we exchange the learning? Uh, is it through a new system or an existing system?
In my experience, changes to the software at scale are very difficult and time consuming
Uh-huh.
overall. So not impossible, but very demanding. And so we used to be more practical. So there was already a process of learning from incidents and reviewing corrective actions from incidents. So then we just build into that. So we started looking into proactive learning, findings, and reactive learning. So
Mhm.
we use that mechanism, and therefore the mechanism for note taking and sharing the results. And different organizations will have different ways of doing that. And so I would be practical and first of all explore what's existing that we can use
Mhm.
before adding new costs and changes and efforts um, to change something.
Yeah, yeah, I see. Well, uh, if people want to find you, where can they find you?
Probably not difficult to find, but if you go to learningfromnormalwork.com, then you will see an overview of what we do. And if you would like to learn more about the shifts that needs to happen in our seeing the work, and if you'd like to learn more about the tools and techniques that we use, then check out my learning, which is a starting point, but very practical and hands-on, and will give you tools to apply in practice.
Okay. I'll also put on the description some links so people can find you and try one or more of your courses.
Wonderful.
Okay. What else would you like? Would you like to ask me any question, Marcin?
Oh, I like that. That's a first as well. um, I like that. Gilvão, how do you see I know that the IOGP guide to learning from normal work that I wrote was translated to Portuguese.
Uh-huh.
Um, how do you see the the understanding, awareness of this particular topic in the Brazilian community?
Okay, I think it's very hard for us to understand that because of our mental model. As you told us, it's a huge problem. It's a global problem because we have been indoctrinated for 70 years, maybe more, to think that we can reach zeros and we can we can fix the worker, and it's very hard for us to understand that it's not that hard to learn from normal work.
Mhm.
And then there is this huge movement here that people are translating and giving some free materials. like this video, like other videos that we are doing, and trying to reach a great number of people, of professionals, in
Mhm,
order to change our mindset, you know?
mhm, mhm. Wonderful, wonderful. That's great to hear, and I'll keep my fingers crossed so that this grows and people learn how to reframe it and then how
Mhm.
to apply it. So we all benefit from it, and hopefully the more people will go
Yeah,
home safe.
yeah. You know, when I started to study things for what's called the new view, we had very few, we had no material in Portuguese. And
Mm,
then we started to translate things, and it was a completely volunteer work. And then
mhm,
when people want to find uh, things for things of learning from normal work, things like HOP, uh, like psychological safety, they will find it already in
mhm,
Portuguese. So I think that's one major reason for this movement in Brazil is growing.
mhm, mhm. Wonderful, wonderful. And so well done to everyone who contributed to this effort of translating the materials and books.
Okay. So, Marcin, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And I hope to see you soon here in Brazil, face to face.
Well, I very much look forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.